Welcome to the CPG Toolbox workshop webinar. Thank you all for joining us this afternoon or this morning, depending on where you are. My name is Jamie, and I will be moderating today's session, which is titled The Deadly Sins of Deductions. So we all know deductions are a necessary evil in the consumer goods industry. So today we want to look at some ways to overcome the problem sets that are associated with poor deduction management, so that you can start shifting your time and energy from managing hundreds of open deductions to managing your trade spend much more efficiently. Before we dive in, I just want to go over a few housekeeping logistics. Everyone's in listen-only mode. If you have any technical difficulties or have any questions, just use the question or chat box. We are going to be taking questions at the end of today's session, but I encourage you to submit your questions as we go throughout this presentation, and we will get to all of them, as many as we can, at the end of the presentation. So now I would like to introduce you to today's presenter, Mr. Rick Pensa. Rick has been in the consumer goods and trade promotion management game for over 4 decades. He has worked across a number of consumer goods categories, including beverages, frozen food, snacks, sporting goods, DIY, you name it. He specializes in trade promotion ROI improvement, TPM software implementations, and category management, just to name a few. So Rick, thank you so much for being with us today. I'm going to turn it over to you now so that we can go ahead and get started.
Well, thank you, Jamie, and thank you to all of you who have taken time out of your busy day to join us. So what we want to talk about today is a little bit about settlement management and who's responsible for deduction management. Is it finance, is it sales, or some other department? And we want to understand what overcoming the deduction control challenges are, and maybe a little bit about where you are on that deduction journey, or the approach that you're taking today. Is it what you want to do today versus tomorrow? So let's ask ourselves a couple of questions. Number one, what are the causes of deductions at your organization? What drives those deductions? And then the next is, what are the largest internal hurdles to good deduction management, to manage those deductions quickly? Deductions are an inevitable situation, and how do we manage that? How do we manage through that? And then, are these settlements that you're working with, are they actually linked to a discrete promotional event with either within your TPM tool, or if you're using Excel spreadsheets, are you able to link those up properly? And I'll give you a little anecdote. I was at a client once, and I asked the VP of Sales and Marketing who does their deduction management. He said, well, finance does. And I asked them, do they link those deductions to a specific and unique event? He said, oh, yes, of course they do. And then the next question was, well, how often do they get it right? And he went, oh, never. So the question is, are you able to link those events to the deductions as they come in? Next is, there is accrual funding a part of your trade planning process? Do you actually have a checkbook, or do you manage to just simply a spend rate? And we'll talk a little bit about that. And then, where's your organization at on that settlements management continuum? So I want to just have a little poll here, if I could, just to kind of get a sense from the people on the phone. Who manages the deductions within your organization? If you'll just click on one of these, and okay, so it looks like we've got about almost an even, well, actually an even split between finance and sales. 36% said finance, 36% said sales, and 29% said other. Thank you for that. So that's what we want to talk about. Just exactly whose job is it anyway? Which department manages those deductions within your organizations? And which department understands that linkage between a promotional deduction claim and the promotional event that triggered that deduction? So there was an interesting survey that I read from the Attain Consulting Group that basically asked this same question. And overwhelmingly, finance was always the one who did the initial research. So their responsibility was initial research. And we looked at it across a number of consumer packaged goods verticals, so from food to pharma to cosmetics. You see cosmetics actually had almost an even split between finance and sales, while food, pharma, and apparel were almost exclusively finance doing the initial research. And then the second question, well, who's responsible for that approval process? And as you can see, sales overwhelmingly becomes the individual who is looking at and trying to understand whether or not the finance people have actually correctly assigned that deduction to the correct event, and then of course just going through that approval process that's within sales. The question is, if the accounts receivable team sees the deduction first, actually as naturally would be the actual activity that happens when the cash application process starts, but sales is responsible for approving deduction, then what happens if you don't properly link together settlements to the events that actually trigger that particular deduction? And so that question becomes then a question of who knows where the skeletons are, if you will, who knows what events were presented to the account, and who knows how to connect that deduction properly within your trade management tool. Now, if you're using a trade management tool like an Excel, then it's going to be a lot more difficult, because then the accounts receivable people will have to be digging around on a shared drive trying to find the right spreadsheet for the right event, for the right account, and then trying to make that linkage in that manner. So what are the dangers to these deduction blind spots? So double dipping. How often have your accounts receivable team already paid a deduction through some sort of a check, or they've already settled that deduction once before, and in a spreadsheet it's very difficult to see that a particular deduction has been already settled by another transaction. Of course, there's write-off versus resolution. If you have no visibility to the event, you're much more prone to write off an event than you will be to resolve that event. So again, visibility keeps coming up. How do I see what these events are, and how do I know what has been settled against those events? Of course, obviously, if you've ever gone through a post-audit scenario where 2 years from now, a deduction that you have already taken off, written off, is now bubbles up, and you've got to go dig back through 2- and 3-year-old emails to figure out what was going on when you had originally fielded that deduction, and so now you're trying to figure out what was going on at the time, and what did we say, and who agreed to it. Meanwhile, the post audit is going on, and you potentially to lose half the money that you put out there. So, and then of course accountability is another key thing, because if you can't link a deduction to an event, then the accountability for the event in the first place. Did it make profit? Did we get the kind of return on investment that we had hoped to get on that particular event? And then finally, productivity. If you're looking at deductions through the prism of spreadsheets as the supporting documentation rather than in a closed loop situation, then your productivity is much slower, and your deductions tend to hang out there with a lot longer dating and aging of that deduction. And then of course misapplication. If you don't have the ability to cleanly apply a deduction to the right event, then of course it's going to potentially get misapplied, and you will not have an opportunity to really understand what drove or what profitability was of that particular event. We looked at that same Attain Deduction Management Survey and saw that in terms of both numbers and total dollars, those elements that the sales team is most in charge of, ads, promotional and rebate claims, allowances and discounts, and to some degree the damages and unsaleables are also a relatively large piece of the deduction landscape. So again, when the sales team knows what ad promotions and rebates and allowances are being presented to the accounts, they have the best line of sight to understanding how to approve or how to settle those deductions against these individual events. The key thing is that we need to give them some sort of a tool and some sort of an atmosphere of collaboration to be able to make those determinations in a clean operation. So one of the other questions was, well, what were the biggest internal challenges to controlling deductions within your organization? And 40% of the respondents said cross-departmental collaboration, a huge event. So and you can almost understand that these cross-department collaborations is almost definitely going to be between finance and sales. Who owns it? Who's responsible for it? How do we clear it quickly? And in order to do so, you need to almost be in some sort of a closed loop sort of situation. So, for example, a given event is funded with a certain set of funds from a certain funding bucket. It's driving a forecast, and when settlement comes, that settlement needs to be driven back to that particular event. That event is tied to a certain number of weeks, in this case 2 weeks, and that settlement is also tied to a certain set of products. So each individual product that is given its accrual, or effective accrual amount based on its volume, and when you're tying it back to that event, now the system will manage that down to the weeks and the SKUs and apply that accrual down to the correct SKU and time frame. Therefore, when you come to the end of the month accrual process, it's more of a push button reporting proposition than it is digging through all of the hundreds or thousands of settlements that have come in throughout that month. So as we have kind of worked through a number of situations, we've talked to and worked through well over 100 accounts as we've done our work, and we find that we find sort of a series of steps along a highway, if you will, or a journey. We see a lot of accounts are just basically in a firefighter mode. There's no collaboration between departments. There's no process per se, and when the finance department is looking for a promotion, they're almost non-existent. And then we've seen different scenarios where we've seen clients literally carrying around boxes of deduction from floor to floor, getting approval, and the collaboration is ad hoc at best. The process is totally manual. When somebody wants to know where a promotion is within the approval process, they have to go find somebody and find out where it is in the box of deductions that they're currently working through, rather than being able to see it as an electronic record in an electronic approval process. So very little to no interconnectivity, and promotional offerings are on a spreadsheet somewhere. And then there's the companies who are they're getting into the process of starting to figure it out. They're successfully linking sales and finance departmentally on deductions, so there's a collaboration between the two departments, and there's at least a rudimentary approval process in place that allows for at least one other pair of eyes to see whether or not that settlement is an accurate settlement. And then, of course, they're beginning to map promotions and settlements together so they can start to have a much more accurate accrual process at the end of each month. And then finally, we see a number of clients who have kind of figured it out. They've got a cross-functional collaboration going on in one system with limited manual processes, and they're able to link funding, promotions, and settlements together in one system in an interconnected nature. And so as you sort of look at where your company is along this continuum, where are you in that journey? So what does a collaboration system look like? A collaboration system will allow you to apply funding to a promotional plan, taking money out of that checkbook to fund the various promotional events that are in play in that, on that promotional plan, managing those funds through accruals and lump sum funding, and then settling those events back against those plans, thereby decrementing the funds and assigning accrual values to SKUs and weeks, and then doing the analysis at the end of the month to be able to understand what money was applied to which SKUs for the period of time, across which fund types, and across which tactic types as well. So what are some of the things that we're trying to talk about today then? We're talking about managing deductions at the point where the most knowledge resides, at that sales level, or at least in a collaboration tool where sales and finance are looking at the same deduction, applying information to the same deduction, and able to put the information that they each have effectively into that same record. Therefore, managing deductions is nearly impossible without good visibility of what deals are out there on the street, what accounts have actually elected to run the deal. So you could have a deal that's been put into play, but the account has rejected that deal, and you can still get deductions against it. Again, without visibility, you're paying money that would be otherwise not offered because the deal was rejected by the account. And of course, you can remove those blind spots by closing the loop with a closed loop process, by interconnective data, and by a collaboration between the various groups that are responsible for managing those deductions. Jamie, do we have any questions?
You bet we do, sir. Thanks, Rick. I think everyone appreciated that, concise presentation. And yes, as you were talking, some folks had some questions. So let's see. The first question came in: why do you think the salesperson is better suited to manage deductions over the finance person?
That's a great question. Go ahead.
I was just saying, what are your thoughts on that question?
Yeah, so the salesperson, I think, is best suited to manage the deduction process because first of all, they're the ones that put the deal in place. They know where those deals are, and a good sales or account manager who understands his account's promotional plan, has put together the plan for the entire year, knows when the events are run, knows when the events are rejected, and knows which events, generally speaking, drove a deduction. So while the finance team may see the deduction first, the sales guy knows where and why that deduction was taken in the first place.
Okay, good. So we have a couple more questions, but if anyone wants to put a question into the question box, now would be an excellent time. Okay, so this question came in from Robert. His question is this, Rick: where is it better to have the approval process? Time of planning, time of settlement, or both?
That's a great question. We've actually seen in our client base really all three. For example, some clients say, just give me the approval process at the time of planning so that I can approve the spend against a particular spend rate. And if we breach that spend rate, send it through another approval process, and then allow the deductions and settlements to sort of happen without an approval process. On the other hand, some will not approve the plan, but only approve the spend. We've got one client who calls it a 4-eye process, where they've got two sets of eyes on the actual expenditure. So I believe, personally, that you ought to have both, because I think you need to have eyes on for the plan in the first place to make sure that the plan meets company objectives, meets spending objectives, and so forth. but then also a plan or an approval at the back end when the actual settlements are happening. And if you have visibility to how many settlements and how much has been settled against a particular event, you have visibility to seeing, in terms of seeing when you're going to be over-settling and whether or not you need to apply or put more money into the fund, if you will, for any given event, and have that approval process work as well.
Okay, I hope that answers your question, Robert. Greg just sent in a question, Rick, so I'm going to jump over to him. He wants to get a little bit more explanation on the slide where you were showing the percentage of deductions versus the percentage of dollars by promotional tactic. And he's wondering if you can explain it a little bit better. Is it the number of dollars associated with the tactic?
Certainly. So within the Attain Consulting survey on deduction management, the respondents were asked to describe the reasons that drove most of their deductions. And so there were two questions. Number one, which drove the most number of deductions, and what percentage of dollars those deductions drove. And so the overwhelming result of that survey question was that promotional discounts, features, price reductions, rebate monies, the monies that we are offering the account to promote or to reduce the price on our goods is what's driving those deductions in an overwhelming manner. You do have some for unsaleables, and obviously others for missed appointments and logistics types of issues, pricing issues, but overwhelmingly deductions are driven by the promotional offerings that are being offered to the accounts.
Thanks, I appreciate that, Rick. I hope that answers your question, Greg. Let's see here. Another question that came in during the presentation, Rick. Can your system tell me what the accrual and expense records should be by SKU and by week?
Yes. So within our system, when we plan an event, we are actually funding that event. So let's say we have an event that's running for 2 weeks. It may be a scan down, and we're paying $1 per unit that goes across the register, and we have some sort of a planned amount of spending that we expect to spend. Within our tool, we actually fund that planned expenditure from a fund, and those funds typically will replicate a general ledger account name, such as trade payments or scan downs or whatever it might be. And so when we create that record, we're actually creating a sort of a future accrual record that says that we will spend X amount of money on each individual SKU for each individual week based on some sort of a promotional forecast. And within our tool, we have the ability to do predictive analytics, so we have base and incremental view or line of sight to the volume. So then when the actual settlement happens, then we settle that event or that deduction back to the specific event, even though the deduction may have actually come 2 or 3 or 4 months after the event ran. So we tie the event and the deduction together, thereby being able to accrue or to basically assign funding to each SKU based on its volume and on the week that that volume occurred in. So if week number 1 had the most volume for that scan down, we can actually accrue back to not only or either actual units, spin units, or to actual POS sales. So the idea is trying to put the right amount of money to the right SKU in the right week based on the volume that SKU and week generated.
Okay, good. A great question came in from Carolyn, and the question is, what about segregation of duties? For example, SOX compliance. Can departments who submit deals and approve the promotions also clear deductions? What are your thoughts, Rick?
That's a great question that goes to collaboration, because in order to keep the lines cleanly defined and yet still have good visibility and understanding of how the various lines of duty and lines of sort of separation of powers, if you will happen. So the finance team can put the supporting documentation against the deduction within a closed-loop system, and yet still be able to rely on and relate back to the sales team to collaboratively place proofs of performance. Within our tool, we're actually built on the Salesforce.com platform, so we utilize Chatter to allow for files to be placed with a certain deduction. So a certain deduction record can get files placed on it from the accounts receivable, can get performance information placed on it from sales, to be able to chatter back and forth, literally like Facebook for Business, where you're able to track conversations rather than using email, to use conversations within the Chatter feed to be able to talk to and about this particular deduction, thereby being able to collaborate even though the separation of powers is still in place. And then finally, as the deduction goes through an approval process, or if any fields are changed, the Chatter actually records who changed it, when it was changed, or when the next approval process was done and finished. And so at the end of the day, when the deduction is closed, you have a full history in that Chatter feed, even though you have separate departments doing what they do and what they're tasked to do within Sarbanes-Oxley. You're able to see all of that activity within one record, within one Chatter feed for that particular deduction record. I hope that answers the question.
All right, I think so. I think you did a good job with that one. She's saying yes, so that's good. One last question a lot of people ask, and if anyone has any final thoughts or comments or questions that they want to ask Rick, now would be a good time. Folks were wondering if this presentation was going to be shared, and the answer is yes. In a couple days, you will all receive an email that will have a link so that you can download the slides, as well as download the entire audio presentation so that you can review it again or perhaps share with a colleague who was unable to attend today. So Rick, I think that's it for the questions. I appreciate all of your time. Thanks for sharing all this information with us. Thank you to everyone on the phone who took time out of their day to join us. Be on the lookout from that email. And thank you for joining us, and I hope everyone has a great day.
Hey, thank you as well.
Thank you.